start with you, Dan. What are alien technologies today as we understand them?
Yeah, well, if I could even just do a quick share screen on that, there's a particular picture I wanted to share, which was the key issue here is the Schumann harmonics. And the Schumann harmonics are what's called a phase conjugate pump wave. So originally, when the moon was planted here by what you're calling the fallen angels, which we call the Anak, they installed generators in the moon to generate the frequencies of the Schumann cascade, very close. The actual phase conjugate pump wave would be 3 hertz up to 19 hertz. The actual Schumann harmonics are 7.83 instead of 7.29. Point being that phase conjugate pump wave, Schumann cascade, not only is that gravity and atmosphere stabilizing, but that was used by the Federation to stabilize the Earth at a time when just after Tiamat blew up and the water caused the Lesser Dryad flood, the Earth was destabilizing. They installed the hollow metal moon with the frequencies generators modulating our atmosphere. The reason it's called a phase conjugate pump wave is because it's tuned to Planck at the 0 point, enabling the charge implosion that stabilizes gravity and atmosphere. So if you calculate golden ratio times Planck, called Planck fire, the cause of gravity, neg entropy, and all charge implosion through 0 point, which stabilizes gravity and atmosphere, you get the cascade 2.78, 11, 19 hertz. It's in blue. The actual Schumann harmonics are in green. To set up the Earth where the Schumann harmonics were so close to a phase conjugate pump wave was the work of the Anak, the Anunnaki. You're calling them fallen angels. And at that point, they were stabilizing the Earth after the Lesser Dryad flood, when there was a war against the Nebu reptilians here. And the moon was not in the Earth, in the solar system before that, actually. There's evidence. And so that's probably the most prime example of installing a frequency generator. And here you see that those Schumann harmonics are actually the brainwave harmonics that cause bliss. So designing the Earth to actually create, designing the solar system where I'm going to stop the screen now. So where the Schumann harmonics are actually implosive took a lot of work. And that is Thoth Hermes, the Anak genius, who's also called Oannes, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, many names. Osiris is the same family. So there is an example of a frequency cascade, which was necessary to stabilize gravity and atmosphere. That's what made the pyramid the Hummer that was implosive in a global wireless power grid. So those Schumann harmonics also amplified the Van Allen belts, which at that time were what kept the bad ETs from getting out of here, because they couldn't get through the Van Allen belt without nuking their way through. That's why they needed the Ark of the Covenant to store their nukes. So that was a trap to keep the Nebu and the Anak here at that time by the Federation. So the use of that cascade also creates the implosion, which today, unmodified in its pure form as it stabilizes to pure conjugation, enables human bliss, which is actually the ensoulment success which Enki Hermes had designed for. So obviously that's a big subject, but my 2 minutes are over. But you see, there's a prime example of frequency modulation by ETs.
Very good. Now, there's a prime example, kids at home, of somebody not paying attention to the instruction for 2 minutes. But actually, that was brilliant, and that really helped to set the context. So I thank you. I thank you for that, Dan. Absolutely brilliant. Very good. Thank you, Dan. Moving to you, what evidence is there, to your knowledge, that alien imprints and technology and interventionism and the corresponding frequencies that they elicit and represent have in fact been influencing our planet?
Well, I was thinking we were moving in the question of the DNA in that regard as well. The point that's exciting to me is that the intent that we perceive through the sort of the high end of the Anunnaki, which would be Enki, Ea, and Hermes, they call it the Adam Kadmon, was that our DNA would be able to implode and make what we call a soul, which is when there's a recursive braiding that happens in DNA. It's thread to string to rope to very fat rope, a braid on a braid, and that's measurable. It responds specifically measurably to coherent EKG. I pioneered the concept of heart coherence. I invented the stories at realheartcoherence.com. So when the low frequencies of the heart and the brain, and they're all related to that infrasound cascade, the same as the Schumann harmonics, from about 3 harmonics up to about 40 hertz, that exact phase conjugate pump wave cascade, when that comes from the heart during the moment of love and when the feeling of bliss and golden ratio in brain waves, the DNA responds measurably vibrating implosively. It becomes centripetal, and that squeezes out at the tip of that braiding pine cone, Shanaz's pine cone, and it squeezes out at the tip of that pine cone at the what's called the Planck threshold, the common musical key signature of all of matter. And at that point of the pine cone emerges a coherent longitudinal, sometimes called scalar wave, from the less coherent transverse, EMF. And that scalar or longitudinal wave coherence, the Egyptians called the Ba from the Ka and the Kesjan body, rainbow light body. And that is measurably what enables us to lucid dream and take memory through death, literally having a soul. Now, for DNA to get the structure to respond to the presence of that pump wave, that implosion of human bliss, to enable humans to have a soul, that is engineering, that is planning, that is millennia of structuring biology to have the resonant implosive geometry. That's why when scientists say, oh, those codons are junk DNA because we can't measure them programming anything, they don't realize that they're the spacers that enables DNA to braid coherently with structure. It's called Grammatical Man, Information, Entropy, Language, and Life is the title of the book. That DNA, like alphabets, gets context density, so you could pick it, it would be self-correcting, literally, is the thesis of the book. Point being that the structure that it took to get DNA able to respond to that implosion, literally able to respond to human bliss, to make the kind of coherence that gives us a soul. Now, that's what Enki in the return calls the Adam Kadmon. The indications are that if your kids can lucid dream and have bliss, they're going to take some memory through death. They're going to have what you call a soul. Now, our institutions on this planet, because they do not know what electrically a soul is, they keep building technologies which prevent the presence of soul. The electrosmog you call Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and 5G, all of these things actively prevent your children from having a soul directly. It is a threat to survival. Survival is that harmonic inclusiveness. And that's the design. That's why Enki, Ea, Osiris is back. Actually, he's in Ganymede. He doesn't want to show his face here because he hates personality worship. But what he calls the Adam Kadmon is the intent, the design, that your kids could have a soul and eventually re-inhabit the stars. That's a fun thing. And that is a genetic program, and it's frequency harmonics. Absolutely.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, moving on. Dan, what, in your view, is the primary motivation behind the attempts to manipulate humankind? And certainly in light of the mRNA intervention we're seeing right now as this grave, sort of existential sort of end of game play by the contrast, as Dave Emery would put it. What are your truest thoughts on this?
Well, we know that we're pretty convinced there are tens of thousands of humanoid cultures in our galactic sector alone, as we've said many times, and the primary mechanism between them is trade, and the primary value of trade between them is DNA, actually, and what makes the DNA that's traded between them have value and power is what we call having a soul. It's very close to what you call psychokinesis. For example, the teenagers who were abducted to steer the time chariot Montauk were all lucid dreamers. Most 90% of the humans abducted by the Greys, the Nebu, after the Greada Treaty, were lucid dreamers. That is, they had DNA that emitted coherent longitudinal, which means eventually that kind of DNA can steer stars, and that's big bucks. That's high value. So the battle really is over who should have the leverage of what we call having a soul, and that conflict We believe, actually, Elena Danan and Alex Collier and others who say the Nebu, the Greys, and the Dracos have in fact been ejected from the solar system, but the residue of their hybrids and parasitism is very much still active here. And that's our job to recognize that primarily by education, as we say, to teach your child to have bliss and have a soul. So the motivation was large-scale parasitism, clearly. And I think, the wrong ETs, the parasites, have been parasitizing human auras for thousands of years. That's not new information. The fact that we humans could take control and steer our own direction absolutely requires that we take control of our own collective bliss, because that is our centripetal force. So functionally, what that means is that once a group of people learns to achieve bliss regularly together, it would mean they can lucid dream together, they can steer tornadoes together, and that form, which is called body polis, is the definition of what politics actually means, the ability to collectively have bliss, meaning they can steer literally through the heart of the sun together. And you could say replaces the need for government, but more than that, it is the biologic definition of government, because it is the biologic definition of the centripetal force that enables a hive mind to steer in exactly the same way that a hive of bees cannot swarm without royal blood, because only the imploding DNA can steer. So that's why we say again and again, if you can train a generation of lucid dreamers, then you win in the ET politics, because you've created what has value. And that's really, what the abductions were about. That's what the Nebu were about. Even the Draco, what the Draco were about was loss of long-term memory, loss of soul. In fact, when they said the fallen angels, you know what it meant when they fell? They lost long-term memory. It means literally they lost the ability to have a soul. Why do you think Charlie the Draco had to abduct the human teenagers to steer the time chair? Because they couldn't lucid dream. Hello, that's our ticket out of here.
Very good. So group plasma, group bliss, group fun is really what steers the highest outcomes. And of course, Dan here is redeeming swingers parties over the last century, but actually in that is something. I mean, presumably people get together to bang one another's partners because there is this kind of subliminal drive. It's a perversion, to be sure, but there is the subliminal drive for group bliss. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's why they go to theaters and why they go to football games. It's that deep primal urge that if we achieve tantric bliss together, it doesn't have a lot to do with sexuality. It could, but what it has to do with is, you cry for each other and you laugh for each other. Eventually you bond to such an extent that you can lucid dream together. We have a luciddreamteam.com, and that is star navigating, and that is climactic.
Very good. And later, because Dan came in on the screen to the Regenesis retreat a couple of days ago and caught up fully with Stephanie.
I was just sitting here thinking I must have said too much in front of the group about Dan and I was just worrying about it. And I don't know, but the fact that we created Planet Heartworks, I don't think we said that. Did we say that?
Group bliss. That was what it was. Exactly.
It was.
We started.
And I said it's 1988, and bliss was so much more available then.
And we're still young. It's amazing.
That's right.
But back up. What do you mean bliss was more available in 1988 with those fucking haircuts and that terrible music? How is that possible?
Do you think it was that
Spandau Ballet?
But the environment was less polluted. It was less polluted.
Well, the 70s maybe, but not the 80s. Surely.
No, it's all a blur, but it's all a dance.
It's all a blur. So Dan, what are your thoughts on this? And how do the meek indeed get to inherit the earth if we're going to be walking through a maelstrom of this kind of demonic interventionism in the next few years?
Well, my preference would be to try to talk about the pure science of the solution of parasitism in general. You know how they say that if you have access to some sort of bliss, which is implosion, you not only will have no plasma parasites, you won't have any stomach parasites. Well, the physics is that if there's implosive force, that centripetal force causes all plasma in the area to be forced through that center point and sorted into phase, and only the shareable wave survives that. Practical example, you know how they said that those who did Agnihotra survived Bhopal and survived Nagasaki? The reason Agnihotra was a survival mechanism, remember, you're lighting the plasma at four-wave mixing, exactly sunrise, sunset, above a copper pyramid, which is called phase conjugate four-wave mixing, implosion. So the reason that Agnihotra, it actually turned the area of the farm we worked at in Poland into literally a Garden of Eden. The fertility spread dramatically. So that was literally four-wave mixing imploding. Agnihotra done religiously, precisely, sunrise, sunset, very powerful plasma implosion. That's an example of a self-sorting environment. So the fact is, if your community builds a bubble of centripetal plasma implosion, for example, labyrinth, Agnihotra, stone circle, a regular bliss ritual, collective lucid dreaming, anything that makes your environment centripetal, it's as practical as when you choose where to put your altar in your room, in your sacred space, and how you build that altar. You doused, you look for the magnetic cross point, then you use the crystal, the stone circle, and then you did the blessing. And eventually, over many years, you build centripetal force. And that practically, literally will sort the electrosmog ultimately. For example, when you use large bale, straw bale construction, large high dielectric, which means organic material masses like a straw bale house or a house with lots of organic material, creates that charge implosion again, and it creates a charge bubble. So the principle of how that implosion happened originally in physics, first measured in phase conjugate optics. You have super dielectrics called barium, strontium, titanate, a phase conjugate mirror, the same thing the Olmec used to phone ancestors, and the way Nostradamus with this coating on his scrying cup. It was a phase conjugate mirror. This is a place where the waves implode and they are sorted. And that sorting, that self-sorting process by implosion ultimately can do the plasma parasites, it can do the negative entities, because it is the torch, and that burning torch is self-sorting.
Beautiful. Well, kids, what Dan is saying is that if you live in a mud hut in Botswana, you're going to be happier and live longer, essentially.
True. It's absolutely true.
Very good. Let me just thank everyone here for a beautiful conversation. Dan, get back to the beach immediately.
Immediately.
Happy to share. Blessings, everybody.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Thanks, Dave Emery. I muted you because you were rustling papers earlier. You get 3 strikes for that. All right. Good to see you, brother. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And David Sarita, thank you, brother. Lovely seeing you today.
Thank you, Sacha. It's a great journey.
Shanaz, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sacha.
She's got a pine cone. Very good.
Yes. Answer to all our problems.
God bless you. Bye, Shanaz.
Thank
Hope
you.
to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Well, Dan was the beautiful soul who introduced you to my Ken years ago. Dan, I know you have a tremendous reverence for Elena. Thank you also for staying the distance for this conversation.
Yes, and I was referring to Enki and Thoth and Enki's Adam Kadmon and Destiny for the Human Soul, and you're the expert. We're glad you're here.
Wonderful. Elena, we understand about the science. Dan Winter has been speaking for decades about human DNA being fractal antenna to off-world systems. Actually, Dan, momentarily speak to that and to what Elena's just revealed.
Well, we could hypothesize a mechanism here. The Spanish study showed what they call the graphene emulet, but what that probably did mean was a super dielectric. Example of super dielectric is what's called the black goo. Which is another carbon kind of emulet. And these super dielectric, the implosion at the phase conjugate implosion at the core is a mechanism for a communicator for better or for worse. In this case, for worse. So those ETs were using super dielectrics like black goo, not unrelated to Bucky fullerene. And that conjugate implosion, that conjugator is a communicator. And whether it's for good or bad, in that case, it's a very narrow spectra conjugator, and they were using that for basically a tie-in to a hive mind. But when that becomes more broad spectrum, that's when it's called conscious. So there's even an example of someone who had black goo who had enough human will to actually emit that carbon poison, actually. So again, it's another example of if you have enough bliss.
Yeah, right. Exactly right. Beautiful. So glad you above that. Dan, what's your thought about the Sphinx and the importance of the Sphinx momentarily?
Well, I think the point Elena makes about the Lesser Dryad and the flood, and the argument was about the water level on the Sphinx, proving the level of the flood at the time. And the point was that I think Graham Hancock was right, that the Lesser Dryas was the time when Enki, Hermes, Thoth, Veracocha, Quetzalcoatl, that team was coming back to try to bring the Earth back after the great catastrophe. And that, as Elena described well in the galactic history, that catastrophe was the Federation at that time trying to boot the Nebu, Draco Gray, and the Anak out of here. And coming through at that time, the point is that the designer of the pyramid complex, presumably Thoth, Hermes, and Ningishita, was actually setting up to bring back what today Elena calls the Ark, and these various memory devices to bring back the information of the pure survival of civilization, which in his case, the caduceus, today we call phase conjugation or charge collapse. And that's what happens inside of these carbon structures. So the lesson of Hermes is there. That's the point.
Indeed, indeed. Elena, have you seen the images of the alien base discovered in the Buceci Mountains outside of Bucharest in Romania in 2004? We've lost her momentarily. We'll see if she comes back in. Dan, have you seen those images?
Peter Moon, and I think that does relate to what Elena and Michael Sala have been calling one of the arcs. And the arcs are these vast storage devices that not only were to store ancient wisdom, but were today to actually propagate plasma to create the seeds of the rejuvenation and return to bliss of whole civilizations. So these, if this is one of the arcs, it should actually
be. I've got the photographs with me, which is why I was asking if you'd seen them or not.
I don't know. I don't. Maybe. I mean,
okay, let me share my screen because I think.
Are they from Peter Moon?
One moment. Tell me if you can see this, Dan. Can you see this?
Oh, yes. I think you showed these once before.
Yeah, I did. Yes. I showed them, I think, in the last symposium. I was going to show to see if she's not in the green room. But yeah, I mean, these are just the most extraordinary. I got these from Bruno Mihailescu and General Mihail.
Yes. Yes.
In Romania.
And if ever there was a suggestion that this relates to the story of Hermes, the designers of pyramids, this is a way to piezoelectrically entrain the conjugate pump wave, the Schumann cascade, called the Hummer, make a gravity diode and stabilize things. Literally, a device for a global wireless power grid is one description of such. And if you measured the spectrum analysis of the weak capacitive field, you would prove the harmonics are not just a Schumann cascade, but a phase conjugate pump wave, presumably. And by the way, would create a rejuvenation field, literally an age reversal field effect. And but presumably also would make a chamber within which you could create the stasis for people like Hermes, Thoth, Ningishita, who we think is coming back in one of these stasis chambers. The original designer of these structures. Elena does talk about that. Those are useful pictures. It'd be great if somebody could actually take a spectrum analysis of the weak capacitive field, which we did for Sam's Bosnian pyramid there. And we got the phase. In fact, Sam's Bosnian pyramid, he had the 53 hertz and the whole cascade for Schumann, and people are coming there for rejuvenation all the time, and they're getting it. But at the top, he measured 28,000 hertz, and then we later figured out the equation why the whole Schumann cascade, all the way up to kilohertz, is measurable in that pyramid, and it's commercially creating rejuvenation and making global wireless power. So you can see what these things mean. And Hermes is the traditional designer of them.
Yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I took my retreat group to the Star Fort here in Bacala. But we've got a perfect Star Fort here. One of the reasons why I felt so attuned when I came here, and just it's an extraordinary vibe. I mean, Stephanie knows she's been here as well. But this Star Fort, of course, is drained of the water, so there's no water in the moating system around it, like most of them around the world. And they've got cannon on the little kind of star angles, old cannon aimed in all directions, claiming that those cannon were there from the conquistadors to fend off the pirates. You know, such abject bullshit. What is your understanding of star forts and what they are or were as capacitors?
Yeah, that's the thing. So it's too easy for conventional contemporary military analysts. They take a look at the star forts. They say, oh, it was more efficient than a square for making defense perimeter. Well, what about the electrical meaning? You know, they don't even consider that. But no, it's true that the star forts were largely made of reasonably good dielectric material, so the capacitance would be excellent. You could, in fact, prove that these devices were creating life force very simply. One, you would measure whether, in fact, they're constructed on Earth grid magnetic lines. That'd be one. That would be a proof that this was part of a longitudinal array, global wireless power, and rejuvenation. And two, you take a device like ours or Karatkov's device, but our flameinmind.com does it beautifully, and you measure the weak capacitive field exactly the way you do brain waves, and you can prove it's imploding just the way we did for Sam's Bosnian pyramid. And you got 500,000 people a year coming every year achieving age reversal commercially.
Right.
So you can see that these things were part of what the Anunnaki called raising a Shem unto the Lord, literally a high-word firestone, Sitchin's own term.
But surely over the ages, I mean, some of these edifices look as though, and monoliths look as though they are thousands, tens of thousands of years of age. Of course, one doesn't believe anything that one hears through popular academia on the age, on the dating of these stone edifices. But surely over time, the so-called ley lines move and flux. And so does that mean that these are decommissioned? They're no longer as powerful as they were when they were conceived?
It is true that even things like the Great Pyramid, as the Earth grid nutates and precesses and is very liquid, that the power of these devices is much weakened when they're not at the magnetic cross. You know, Korotkov measured you only get commercially military valuable telepathy where magnetic lines actually cross, and you measure that minima in nanotesla. So yes, the strength of the magnetic cross is everything, because that's what sets up the longitudinal node, and there is the still point for all forms of radio at a distance, DNA radio, telepathy, global wireless power. It's all about a fractal nodal longitudinal wireless power grid array, and the stability of that is everything. As you know, every ancient temple, labyrinth, stone circle, pyramid was always built at a magnetic cross for a very important reason. And today, you know, Therify works better for the same reason.
Simple as that. Simple as that. It's all to do with coherence, as you've been maintaining for a very long time. What is the interrelationship, as you understand it, between pyramids, whether we're talking about the pyramids in Bosnia, the ones in China, Indonesia, in Mexico, in Egypt, all around the world? What is the interrelationship between pyramids and star forts, for instance?
Well, you know, there's the story of the Chinese Shenxi pyramid that are said to be in the geometry of Alpha Draconis. Heaven's Mirror, Hancock's book, was about the Draco star map there, which also exists in the Chinese pyramid array. Whereas the Egyptian, of course, you have the Orion star map. So part of that, by creating a fractal map of a stellar array, was enabling the portal function, which is one of the important functions that Jean-Charles Moyen achieved a portal literally by location when his brainwaves made that same frequency signature. And that is the reason I'm speaking in a month with Elena Denon in Tours near Paris, because everybody wants to know, well, when we measured Jean-Charles brainwaves and he was literally with witnesses achieving Stargate portal, what does that mean? What it means is that was creating the necessary phase conjugates implosion broad spectrally enough that you could embed into a node of that array and use it as a portal or Stargate. And there's that famous place in South America, I think one of the names for it is Intihuana's Prism, which was literally a portal, and they've seen people disappear there. Well, the physics of being able to use the array of nodes to become distributed, it's actually surprisingly easy to think about. You already inhabit an array. It's called your synapses. So, your consciousness is a plasma tornado, and the kids who see without their eyes say a vortex appeared, and now I can see without my eyes. And now we know how you take consciousness out of your body. You take that tornado with you. Well, when the pinhole at the center of that vortex is compressed enough, like Jodie Foster in the dodecahedron in the movie Contact, when the pinhole is compressed enough, you can inhabit the larger array and become coherent enough. But there are definite risks. We know that Swaru actually did too much, portals and time travel and literally fractionated her soul. It's true. Mm. And even Elena admits that she comes back dizzy from portal experience, and it takes a great deal of focus. So, using these Stargate portals has many issues, but the fundamental physics is actually not that complicated. The frequency signature of the send point, highly complex array, has to exactly match the receive point. And that creates it's exactly how internet protocol propagates packets. The packets in that array are looking at the distribution point. The thing is, from the longitudinal node here to the longitudinal node light years away, there's an infinite or a large number of harmonics of golden ratio times c of the speed of light of wave node propagations. So the greater the compression at that still point, the farther the Stargate goes.
Very
good. Oh, yes, Elena's back with us. Concluding practical example. So as Elena Denon often said, the Orion Wars are over the biggest Stargate in the galaxy, the trapezium, a four-wave mixing square in the cube heart of Orion. Well, the reason that Stargate goes farther is because the compression nodes of mass are the greatest there. So that's an example of portal. Elena.
Beautiful. Dan, very quickly, Enki and Lil, Cain and Abel, are these the same stories?
Even Lawrence Gardner got a big part of that story right in the Genesis of the Grail King, Cain, and this was competition among the brothers, which is the story of Enki and Lil as well. What Elena brings up has a lot of real depth here. If Enlil was a big part of the Yahweh story of the Jewish religion, and if the origins of the Hebrew alphabet, I spent half a lifetime on the physics here, was the shadows of the self-organizing torus in a tetracube, which is a subset of implosive alphabets like hypercubic or phenomenology. So the Hebrew alphabet was a way of actually keeping us in a kind of a cage, ? The original film series about The Prisoner actually started out with visualizing you're in the cage of the Hebrew alphabet. It's containing you because you can only think tetracubic thoughts with the tetracubic alphabet. What does this mean? Very deep, insidious mind control. And does this mean then your DNA cannot implode if it's only tetracubic and never pent implosive? Very deep story here, quite messy. And Elena tells a very exciting story when she tells how Enlil Yahweh finally got his comeuppance. I love it when Elena tells that story.
Elena, you have to tell that story.
Which one then? Because Enlil is Yahweh.
Yeah, when Enlil got his comeuppance, when he got kicked out with this, they had a trial, basically. Is that right?
Oh, yes.